You've done it again. Someone questioned your decision, and instead of standing firm, you launched into a paragraph-long justification. You explained your reasoning, provided context, maybe even apologized for the confusion, and with every word, you watched their respect for you drain away. The paradox is cruel, but absolute. The more you explain yourself, the less people believe you. And somewhere deep down, you already know this. Why, there's a psychological principle that governs human perception called the certainty heuristic. It states that people equate confidence with competence and silence with strength. When you over-explain, you're not clarifying, you're confessing doubt. You're essentially telling the other person that you don't fully believe in what you just said, so why should they? Every additional sentence is a crack in your armor. Every justification is an invitation to question you further. And the person who explains the least controls the conversation. The person who explains the most becomes its servant. Watch a courtroom drama, any courtroom drama, and you'll notice something. The guilty always over-explain. They add unnecessary details. They volunteer information no one asked for. They create elaborate stories when a simple answer would suffice. Meanwhile, the innocent or the powerful give short, direct responses. They don't feel the need to fill the silence because they're not afraid of judgment. This isn't just a screenwriting technique, it's rooted in reality. Investigators are trained to spot over-explanation as a red flag for deception or insecurity. The more you say, the more you reveal that you're trying to convince yourself as much as the other person. You see this dynamic everywhere once you notice it. A manager who constantly justifies their decisions to their team loses authority. A parent who negotiates endlessly with a child loses control. A partner who feels compelled to explain every action creates suspicion where none existed. Over-explanation doesn't build trust, it erodes it. Because trust is built on consistency and self-assurance, not on verbose rationalizations. When you explain too much, you're signaling that you need external validation to feel secure in your choices, and people can smell that need like blood in the water. But there's a historical example that illustrates this perfectly. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, President John F. Kennedy faced immense pressure to explain his naval blockade strategy to both the public and his critics. His advisors urged him to hold press conferences to detail every military consideration, to justify the administration's restraint in not immediately bombing Cuba. Kennedy refused. He made one clear statement and then went silent. He let the actions speak. And the Soviet Union, watching this unfold, interpreted his silence as resolve. Khrushchev blinked. Had Kennedy spent those 13 days explaining and re-explaining his position, broadcasting uncertainty through elaboration, history might have ended differently. Silence projected strength. Explanation would have projected doubt. But here's where it gets more insidious. You've been conditioned since childhood to believe that explanation equals responsibility. And teachers rewarded you for showing your work. Parents demanded to know your reasoning. Society told you that articulate people who can express themselves are successful. And all of that is true, to a point. The problem is, you never learned where that point ends. You never developed the filter that distinguishes between appropriate explanation and desperate justification. So now, as an adult, you default to over-explanation in situations where it actively hurts you. You treat every interaction like a math test where you need to show your work to get full credit. But social dynamics don't work like math tests. In social hierarchies, showing your work often means showing your weakness. Consider the difference between these two responses. Someone challenges your decision at work. Response 1. I chose this approach because I felt it aligned with our goals, and I thought about the alternatives, but this seemed like the best fit given the timeline. And I know it might not be perfect, but I believe it's the right direction, though I'm open to feedback. Response 2. I chose this approach. It aligns with our goals. The first response is a dissertation. The second is a declaration. The first invites debate, doubt, and further questioning. The second invites acceptance or direct opposition, nothing in between. Which person do you respect more? Which person seems more confident in their judgment? The answer is obvious, yet you continue to deliver response 1 in your own life, wondering why people don't take you seriously. The underlying mechanism here is something psychologists call the pratfall effect, but in reverse. The pratfall effect suggests that competent people become more likable when they make small mistakes because it humanizes them, but this only works when competence is already established. When you overexplain, you're making yourself vulnerable before you've established authority. You're essentially committing a pratfall without the competence cushion to catch you. Instead of appearing human, you appear uncertain. Instead of appearing humble, you appear insecure. The timing is everything. Vulnerability can be endearing, but only when it comes from a position of demonstrated strength. You've probably noticed this in your own reactions to others. When someone you respect keeps their answer brief, you accept it and move on. When someone you're unsure about does the same, you might probe a bit, but if they remain consistent, your respect grows. But when someone launches into an unsolicited explanation, something shifts in your perception. You start to wonder what they're hiding. You start to question the decision you might have accepted without a second thought. Their explanation created doubt where none existed. This is the cruelty of over-explanation. It solves a problem that wasn't there and creates one that is. There's also a power dynamic embedded in explanation itself. When you explain, you're positioning yourself as accountable to the other person. You're granting them the authority to judge your reasoning. Sometimes this is appropriate. If your boss asks for your rationale, explanation is expected. If a client needs clarification, providing it is professional. But when you volunteer explanations to peers, subordinates, or people who haven't earned the right to question you, you're inverting the power structure. You're placing yourself beneath them. You're asking for their approval when none was required. And once you ask for approval, you give them the power to withhold it. This connects to a concept in negotiation theory called anchoring. The first person to state a clear position without hedging sets the anchor point for the entire conversation. When you over-explain, you're not anchoring, you're drifting. You're showing all your cards and revealing your internal negotiation process. Skilled negotiators know that the less you say, the more power you retain. They make statements, not arguments. They present conclusions, not processes. This isn't about being secretive or manipulative. It's about understanding that your internal deliberation doesn't need to become everyone else's entertainment. The decision is the product. Your reasoning is the factory. No one needs a factory tour unless they're buying the company. Think about the people you admire most, the ones who command rooms without raising their voices, the ones whose opinions carry weight, the ones who seem unshakable in their convictions. How often do they over-explain themselves? Rarely, if ever. They speak with economy. They're comfortable with silence. They don't feel compelled to fill every gap in conversation with justification. And this isn't because they're arrogant or don't value others' perspectives. It's because they've internalized a truth you're still learning. Your worth is not determined by your ability to convince others of it in real time. Your decisions don't become valid through explanation. They become valid through outcomes. But there's a deeper, darker layer to this. Over-explanation isn't just about insecurity, it's often about control. When you explain excessively, you're trying to control how others perceive you. You're attempting to guide their thought process, to preempt their objections, to manage their judgment of you. It's a subtle form of manipulation that backfires because people resent being told how to think. They resist conclusions that are handed to them fully formed. When you over-explain, you're not respecting their intelligence or their autonomy. You're treating them like they need your guidance to reach the correct interpretation. Oh, and people will reject your conclusion just to reassert their independence, even if they might have agreed with you otherwise. There's a famous study in social psychology where researchers asked people to cut in line at a copy machine. When they simply asked, "Can I cut in line?" they had a moderate success rate. When they added a reason, even a completely meaningless one like, "Can I cut in line because I need to make copies?" their success rate increased significantly. This study is often cited to prove that people respond well to explanations. But here's what's rarely mentioned. The explanations that worked were brief and confident. When researchers tested longer, more elaborate explanations filled with justifications and apologies, the success rate dropped. People became suspicious. They started questioning. The explanation itself became the problem. The lesson isn't that you should always explain. It's that if you must explain, do it with brutal conciseness. You lose respect when you over-explain because you're essentially auditioning for approval in a situation where approval should be assumed. Think about that. Every time you launch into an unprompted justification, you're performing for an audience that didn't buy tickets. You're seeking validation from people who might not have questioned you at all. This creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. Your over-explanation signals that questioning you is appropriate. So they do. Then you explain more, which invites more questioning, which makes you explain even more. It's a death spiral of diminishing authority. The only way to break it is to stop feeding it. Consider how this plays out in personal relationships. When you constantly explain your whereabouts, your choices, your thoughts, you're training the other person to expect and demand explanations. You're establishing that you're accountable to them for your every move. And this might seem like transparency or healthy communication, but there's a line. On one side is mutual respect and open dialogue. On the other side is a parent-child dynamic where you're perpetually justifying your existence. Many relationships deteriorate not because of what one person does, but because the other person over-explains everything, creating an exhausting dynamic where nothing can be accepted at face value. Trust cannot coexist with constant explanation. A one must give way to the other. There's also a neurological component to this that you should understand. When people hear a confident, concise statement, their brains process it as factual information. When they hear a long, hedging explanation, their brains shift into analytical mode. They start looking for inconsistencies, evaluating your logic, questioning your premises. You've essentially invited them to debate you by providing them with ammunition. And this is why lawyers tell clients to answer questions directly without elaborating. This is why public relations experts train spokespeople to stay on message. This is why politicians, whatever you think of them, understand that a soundbite beats a seminar. The human brain is designed to conserve energy. When you make people work to understand you, they'll often choose the path of least resistance, skepticism. Now, you might be thinking this advice only applies to certain contexts. Maybe you believe that in intimate relationships or with close friends, over-explanation is expected or even desired. And yes, there's a difference between appropriate openness and the compulsive justification we're discussing. But even in your closest relationships, chronic over-explanation damages respect. Your best friend doesn't need a 20-minute explanation for why you can't make dinner. Your partner doesn't need a dissertation on why you chose one route home over another. When you over-explain in personal relationships, you're not being considerate, you're being anxious, and that anxiety becomes contagious. The other person starts to wonder if there's something to be anxious about. Your explanation creates the very concern it was meant to prevent. Here's the test. Next time you're about to explain yourself, pause and ask whether you're being asked to explain or whether you're volunteering it. If someone directly requests clarification, provide it, briefly. If no one asked and you feel the urge to explain anyway, that urge is insecurity talking. That urge is the part of you that doesn't trust your own judgment enough to let it stand alone. That urge is the voice that believes you only have value if you can prove it in every moment. That voice is lying to you. Your decisions don't need a defense attorney. They need a confident executor. There's a concept in Eastern philosophy, particularly in Zen Buddhism, about the power of Emma, the space between things. In music, the silence between notes is as important as the notes themselves. In conversation, the space between words carries meaning. When you fill every silence with explanation, you eliminate ma. You create a wall of sound that overwhelms rather than communicates. The most powerful communicators understand that what you don't say is often more impactful than what you do. They trust the silence. They trust the other person to fill in gaps. They trust themselves enough not to control every aspect of how they're perceived. Think about apologies for a moment. A genuine apology is short and direct. I'm sorry, I was wrong, it won't happen again. That's powerful, that's accountable. Now compare it to this. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I was just really stressed, and I know that's not an excuse, but I want you to understand where I was coming from, and I've been dealing with a lot lately, and I really value our relationship, so I hope you can forgive me because I truly didn't intend for this to happen. That's not an apology. That's a negotiation. That's an attempt to dilute responsibility through volume of words. The first apology accepts full accountability. The second tries to redistribute it. Which one would you respect more? Which one would actually repair the relationship? Over-explanation turns even your moments of accountability into performances of evasion. You also need to understand the role of status in all of this. High-status individuals in any social hierarchy explain less. This isn't arbitrary. It's because their position grants them the presumption of competence. When a CEO makes a decision, they might share the what, but rarely the why, unless specifically asked by the board. When a master craftsman chooses a technique, apprentices don't question it. They observe and learn. A status creates a buffer where your decisions are granted legitimacy by default. But here's the trap. You can't build status by mimicking high-status behavior alone. You can't just stop explaining and expect respect to follow. You need to combine concise communication with consistent competence. The silence must be backed by results. Otherwise, you're just being cryptic, not confident. However, and this is crucial, waiting until you feel completely confident before you stop over-explaining is a mistake. Confidence and behavior have a bi-directional relationship. Acting confident builds genuine confidence. Speaking with economy, even when you're uncertain, trains your brain to trust your judgment. Every time you resist the urge to over-explain, you're reinforcing a neural pathway that says, my decisions are valid as they are. Every time you give in to the urge, you're reinforcing, I need external validation to feel secure. The behavior shapes the belief as much as the belief shapes the behavior. You can think your way into acting differently, or you can act your way into thinking differently. The latter is often faster. Let's address the fear beneath all of this. The reason you over-explain is because you're terrified of being misunderstood. You believe that if people don't have the full context, they'll judge you unfairly. They'll think you're incompetent, unthoughtless, or careless. So you preemptively provide that context, hoping to control their perception. But here's the reality. You will be misunderstood, constantly, by everyone. No amount of explanation will prevent it because people interpret everything through their own biases, experiences, and agendas. The person determined to misunderstand you will do so no matter how clearly you explain. The person willing to understand you will do so even if you say very little. Your energy is better spent building a track record than crafting defenses. There's also the matter of respect versus likability. These are not the same thing, and conflating them causes immense damage. Over-explanation might make you seem more approachable, more relatable, even more likable in the short term. People might appreciate your transparency, but they won't respect you more for it. Respect is built on boundaries, consistency, and demonstrated competence. Likability is built on accessibility and agreeableness. Sometimes these overlap, often they don't. You need to decide which matters more to you in any given context. If you want to be liked, being open and explanatory can help. If you want to be respected, you need to guard your words like they cost you something, because in the economy of social capital, they do. Consider historical figures known for their commanding presence. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and philosopher, or wrote extensively in his private meditations, but spoke sparingly in public. His words carried weight because they were rare. Winston Churchill could deliver rousing speeches, but in private meetings and negotiations, he was known for letting others talk while he listened and then delivering a brief, decisive statement. Steve Jobs famously answered complex technical questions with simple, sometimes maddeningly vague responses. It just works. People don't know what they want until you show them. These weren't elaborate explanations. They were declarations that left the burden of interpretation on the listener, and that burden created respect, even among those who disagreed with him. Now, there's a skill you need to develop: the ability to distinguish between explanation and clarification. Clarification is responding to a specific question with relevant information. Asks, "Why did you choose this approach?" Asks, "Why did you choose this approach?" A clarification might be, "It addresses the core issue with minimal resource investment." An explanation would be, "Well, I looked at 5 different options and I wasn't sure about any of them at first, but then I talked to a few people and did some research, and this one seemed like it might work, even though it's not perfect. Oh, and I know there are risks, but I thought we should try something rather than nothing." See the difference? One informs, one performs. You need to become comfortable with the discomfort of being questioned. When someone challenges your decision and you don't immediately launch into a defense, there's a moment of tension, silence, uncertainty. Your instinct is to fill that space, to resolve the tension through explanation. Resist that instinct. Sit in that discomfort. Actually, let the other person sit in it too. Often they'll answer their own question. They'll think it through and realize the logic without you spelling it out. Or they'll ask a more specific question that you can answer concisely. Or they'll simply accept your position because your silence communicated that this isn't up for debate. That moment of discomfort is where respect is either built or destroyed. Filling it with words destroys it. Occupying it with calm presence builds it. And there's a dark truth about human nature that you need to accept. People are more influenced by how you make them feel than by your actual reasoning. When you over-explain, you make them feel superior. You've placed them in the position of judge, and that feels good to them. It strokes their ego, but it diminishes yours. When you state your position briefly and move on, you make them feel like they're in the presence of someone who knows something they don't. And that creates a different feeling. Respect tinged with curiosity or even slight intimidation. You're not trying to make people afraid of you. You're trying to make them recognize that you're someone who doesn't need their approval to proceed. That recognition is the foundation of respect. Let's talk about the professional context specifically, because this is where over-explanation does some of its worst damage. In meetings, the person who talks the most is rarely the person perceived as most competent. There's an inverse relationship. The leader who speaks last and least, who asks questions and listens, and then delivers a brief decision, commands the room. The participant who feels compelled to explain every thought, to show their work, to prove they've considered every angle, becomes background noise. Your colleagues start to tune you out, not because your ideas are bad, but because you drown them in unnecessary detail. Economy of language is economy of attention. Respect others' attention by not wasting it, and they'll respect you in return. Here's an exercise that will change how you communicate. Before you speak, especially in moments where you feel the urge to explain, mentally edit your response down to one sentence, not a run-on sentence, one clear, declarative sentence. If you can't distill your point to that level, you don't have a clear point yet. This doesn't mean you always speak in single sentences. It means you train yourself to identify the core of what you're trying to communicate, stripped of all the defensive padding you've wrapped around it. Once you know that core sentence, you can decide if additional context is necessary. Usually, it's not. The paradox of persuasion is that the less you try to persuade, the more persuasive you become. When you over-explain, you're clearly trying to persuade, which triggers skepticism. When you simply state your position and demonstrate confidence in it through your demeanor and your willingness to let it stand without defense, you bypass that skepticism. You're not trying to change anyone's mind. You're simply existing in your truth. And that authenticity, that lack of performance, is inherently more credible than any argument you could construct. People believe what they discover more than what they're told. And stop telling them how to think about you and let them discover your competence through observation. There's also the matter of emotional labor. Over-explanation is exhausting, not just for the listener, but for you. Every time you launch into a justification, you're spending emotional and cognitive energy managing someone else's perception of you. That energy could be spent on actual productive work, on strategic thinking, on rest. When you stop over-explaining, you reclaim that energy. You lighten your own load. The mental freedom that comes from not constantly defending yourself is profound. You'll find that you have more clarity, more presence, more capacity for the things that actually matter. The respect you gain from others is almost a side benefit compared to the respect you gain for yourself. Now, some relationships in your life are built on your over-explanation. There are people who've come to expect it, even demand it. When you change this pattern, they'll resist, or they'll accuse you of being secretive, cold, or uncommunicative. They'll try to pull you back into the old dynamic because it served them. Your over-explanation made you manageable, predictable, easy to control. When you stop providing it, you disrupt the power balance, and they won't like it. This is the test. The people who respect you will adapt to your new boundaries. The people who only valued you for your compliance will fall away. And that's not a loss. That's a filter. And think about credibility for a moment. What makes someone credible? Credentials help. Track record matters. But in day-to-day interactions, credibility largely comes from congruence between words and actions, and from the confidence with which you present information. When you hedge, qualify, and over-explain, you're signaling incongruence. You're saying the words, but your delivery suggests you don't fully believe them. When you speak plainly and briefly, there's alignment. Your words and your energy match. That alignment reads as credibility, as truth. Even if you're wrong about the content, the delivery creates an impression of someone who believes what they're saying, and belief is contagious. Here's a specific scenario to illustrate the point. You're asked why you didn't complete a task. Response 1, I didn't have time. I prioritized X and Y instead. Response 2, I know I should have gotten to it, but I was dealing with X and I thought Y was also important, and there were some unexpected issues, and I really did try to fit it in, but the day just got away from me, and I apologize if that created problems. The first response is an explanation of fact. The second is a plea for mercy. The first maintains your status as someone making strategic decisions about time allocation. The second paints you as overwhelmed and disorganized. Same situation. Are vastly different outcomes based solely on word economy. You must also learn to recognize when explanation is being weaponized against you. Some people will ask you to explain yourself not because they need information, but because they want to watch you squirm. They're testing you, probing for weakness. If you take the bait and launch into a detailed explanation, you've failed the test. You've revealed that their opinion matters too much to you. The correct response is proportional to their actual authority. If they have legitimate standing to question you, provide a brief, direct answer. If they don't, something like, "I made a judgment call," or "I'm comfortable with the decision," ends the conversation. You're not being rude. You're establishing that you're not available for interrogation by those who haven't earned that right. There's an interesting linguistic phenomenon related to this: filler words and hedging language. On things like kind of, sort of, I think, maybe, possibly, these all serve to soften your statements and make you seem less certain. When combined with over-explanation, they're absolutely deadly to your credibility. I kind of think that maybe we should possibly consider this approach because I sort of feel like it might work better. That sentence inspires zero confidence. We should use this approach inspires action. Monitor your language for these hedges. Eliminate them ruthlessly. Every qualifier you remove is a percentage point increase in perceived competence. Let's address the elephant in the room: gender and cultural factors. Women and people from certain cultural backgrounds are often socialized to over-explain, to soften, to make themselves smaller through language. There's additional social pressure and punishment for being too direct. This is real, and it complicates the advice to stop over-explaining. But here's the thing. The social dynamics don't change based on fairness. They are what they are. You can choose to over-explain to meet social expectations and pay the cost in respect, or you can gradually adjust your communication style and weather the initial resistance. Neither choice is easy, but one builds the world you want to live in, and the other perpetuates the one you don't. The people who will judge you harshly for being direct were never going to fully respect you anyway. The ultimate goal is not to become cold or uncommunicative. It's to become intentional. Every word you speak should be a choice, not a reflex. When you explain, it should be because explanation serves a purpose, not because you're managing anxiety. When you're brief, it should be because brevity serves the interaction, not because you're trying to perform confidence you don't feel. Intentionality is the key, and intentionality requires that you develop comfort with other people's discomfort. And their confusion is not always your problem to solve. Their questioning is not always your responsibility to satisfy. Sometimes the most respectful thing you can do is trust them to handle not knowing every detail of your thought process. Consider what you want your legacy to be in your relationships and professional life. Do you want to be remembered as someone who was always explaining, justifying, seeking approval? Or do you want to be remembered as someone whose words mattered because they were scarce and well chosen? Every interaction is a brick in that legacy. Every time you resist over-explanation, you're building a reputation as someone who trusts their own judgment. Every time you give in to it, you're reinforcing a reputation as someone who doesn't. The pattern you establish today becomes the perception people have of you tomorrow. Choose carefully. You lose respect when you over-explain because respect is fundamentally about trust, and over-explanation signals distrust in yourself. If you don't trust your own decisions enough to let them stand without elaborate justification, why should anyone else trust them? This is the core truth beneath all the techniques and examples. Respect flows toward those who demonstrate self-trust, and self-trust is communicated through the willingness to be brief, to be questioned, to be misunderstood, and to remain secure in your position regardless. That security isn't arrogance. It's the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you've made the best decision you could with the information you had, and that's enough. It has to be enough, because no amount of explanation will ever make it more than that. So here's what you do starting now. Notice the urge to over-explain. Feel it rising in your chest. That panic that someone might think less of you if you don't provide context, and acknowledge it, and then choose differently. Deliver the short version. Sit in the discomfort. Watch what happens. Most of the time, nothing bad happens. People accept your answer and move on. Sometimes they push back, and you'll get to practice holding your ground with grace. Rarely, you'll face genuine consequences for being less forthcoming. And in those cases, you'll learn to calibrate. But the default must shift from explanation to brevity, from defense to declaration. And this isn't about being perfect. It's about breaking a pattern that's been costing you respect for years. The people who matter will respect you more. The people who don't won't matter as much. And you'll respect yourself more, which is ultimately the only respect you can't afford to lose. Start practicing this today in low-stakes interactions and watch how the dynamic shifts. Notice who treats you differently. Notice how you feel differently. And if you found this useful, consider what other patterns in your communication and behavior might be silently undermining you, and commit to examining them with the same ruthless honesty.